Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Laura in the Newscast studio.
And Paddy in the Newscast studio.
I'm glad we all remembered our names.
Laura, I'm impressed that you've done, 96 hours work solid and you didn't have any breakfast this morning.
That's why I'm pleased I remembered my name.
You've just been eating news. This is Newscast, which is the BBC's daily news podcast, although in the last few weeks it's felt sort of hourly. And on Wednesday I did an episode that was 6 hours long.
Did you?
I did,
hadn't mentioned that before.
So raise your 12-hour election night marathon. I did 6 hours. Right, so we will talk about what's happening right now in Downing Street because the new cabinet are meeting. We'll talk about what might happen with the Conservatives after their thumping by a combination of Labour, the Liberal Democrats and Reform. But should we just sort of reminisce about election night itself? And I just wonder, how do you both feel now that actually you've been able to, well, I don't know if you've slept on it, but rather than just being like living in the moment and like feasting on all the results as they come in, now that you've actually been able to sort of sit back and look at the big picture?
It is a huge, huge change for the country. I mean, elections, apart from pandemics, are probably the biggest news stories that any of us ever cover. And it is a incredibly significant change of direction for the country. Obviously, in the campaign, there was a lot of discussion about whether Labour and the Tories actually were really close to each other on some big issues. Did they accept the same sort of economic terrain? And there is some merit in that argument. However, the thing I think is always underestimated at moments like this is how much the personalities, the principles, the hinterlands, the instincts and the reflexes of the individuals involved are. And the changing of the guard that we witnessed, that we saw yesterday in Downing Street, that we saw at all those counts around the country as they came over on Thursday, is a genuinely enormous moment for the country. And governments, whatever they write down in their manifestos, very often end up being defined by events. And the reflex and response to events is about who people are and their whole kind of credo and belief system, not what they wrote down in their manifesto. So how will Keir Starmer respond in the years to come to events that we don't yet know?
Paddy?
Well, a bad time for incumbents. The SNP spanked in Holyrood. The Conservatives, after 14 years, spanked at Westminster, effectively asking me as a voter to give them 19 years. A bad time for Joe Biden. A bad time for President Macron.
What constituency is he standing in?
Well,
I know what you mean.
Well, he's standing in the constituency called incumbency.
Yes.
And it's a good time
Macron?
for our system. Yes. And it's a good time for our system. We've undergone a massive political change. I don't mean that I'm saying that the Keir Starmer is Karl Marx. I'm saying that all the people who ran the country 1 hour were replaced 1 hour later without our people contesting the system as they do in the United States. There is a bad, smelly tone to our national conversation which needs to improve. Media have a role to play in that. Radio 4 could have a great role to play in that as well, trying to bring educated debate, not tittle-tattle and rubbish. But I think we should be humble. The public have spoken and 40% of them couldn't be bothered.
And I could tell you feel passionate because you just whacked the arm of the armchair. The two things I'm thinking that I maybe got a bit wrong on the night itself were initially maybe exaggerating the impact of Reform because the exit poll had them on 13 seats potentially. They ended up with, well, first of all, 4, and then they got a 5th one right at the end of the counting process yesterday. And because they were coming very strong second in lots of the seats as they came in, I was thinking, oh, whoa, there's a massive Reform move. Actually, historically, UKIP came second in lots of seats in the past as well. So I was wondering, maybe did I exaggerate it too much about Reform? And we can discuss actually Reform's influence in a bit. And the second thing is, when the exit poll came in with the Tories on 3 figures rather than 2, I found myself going, oh, that's not so bad for them, which disguised the fact that historically it was very bad for them.
Oh,
it wasn't as bad as some of the polls had suggested.
Well, that's why boringly, probably every single weekend and almost every time I opened my mouth in the last 6 weeks, in the last 6 months, I've said, don't believe the polls. The polls are important and they're significant, but they're an indication, not an accurate guide. And the wildest end, we talked about it a lot last week, some of the MRP polling was crazy. I'm not criticising that way of polling, but as we were saying clearly on News Newscast, which if you just turned your radio on, you're listening to Newscast, you haven't gone completely loopy. The crazier end of the MRP polling was really quite crazy. Their methodology was clear. It's how they do that. But the point is, as we kept trying to say, is the range of outcomes was enormous. So somebody was always going to be wrong when it came to the polling, because the predictions of the scale of the Labour majority went from, 200 and something completely crackers all the way down to something much more, realistic, like kind of even down at sort of 60, 70, depending on what happened in different seats. But actually, I think it's pretty much where I expected it to end up by the time we got to Thursday morning.
Do you think on reform, though, I've gone from overestimating them to now underestimating them?
No, I think their impact on the Conservatives was absolutely devastating. I think there's no doubt about that. And I think Labour, although they are absolutely cock-a-hoop and justifiably so, but I think smarter people in the Labour Party will look at some of the places like where in Leicester, where Jonathan Ashworth, very prominent and important member of Keir Starmer's team, lost his seat to somebody campaigning a pro-Palestinian candidate. That was a complete shock. It almost happened to Wes Streeting in his East London constituency. It almost happened to Jess Phillips in Birmingham. And these little pockets of insurgent, and they're under the radar. But that's a very serious thing that smarter Labour people will be thinking, OK, that's something we got to watch.
You are taking us to Labour. I've heard some themes that I hope we do discuss, especially as we've promised to discuss them. But given that you've mentioned Labour, given that you've told us, and I know, Laura, you've got a scoop to tell us about what's going on in Downing Street, given that you, Adam, have started by saying there's a cabinet meeting today, let's just reboot by hearing from the new Prime Minister.
But whether you voted Labour or not, in fact, especially if you did not, I say to you directly, my government will serve you. Politics can be a force for good. We will show that. We've changed the Labour Party, returned it to service, and that is how we will govern. Country first, party second.
Funny hearing that again, sort of like 20 hours later, and just realising the massive contradictions there. So massive Labour landslide. Oh, but I, Keir Starmer, realised loads of you actually didn't vote for us. And we're going to change things massively, but it's going to take ages. So we'll just get started. And then you just think, well, hang on, are those two contradictions the things that might kind of dominate the next 5 years?
Well, that's a challenge for politicians, isn't it, to give a nuanced message. But also, actually, I was talking to a senior Conservative this morning. That's the point of politicians who are broadly in the mainstream. And what they would say is that is what separates them from people at the populist end of things who say, here's a big, simple solution. Everybody vote for me.
Flick this switch.
Flick this switch. And that's the difficulty, actually, of moderation, in a sense. But he even used that word yesterday. He talked about moderate. He talked about being kind of mainstream. And I think both he and Rishi Sunak, actually, in his speech, they both kind of made a nod to all that incredible churn that is going on in the world right now. And whether that's, as a Conservative, Rishi Sunak thinking, oh, reform, or whether that's a Labour politician thinking, oh, look at these other kind of forces out there. So he is setting that stage there, saying, look, I'm going to hold fast to the middle. He's not going to be pushed around by people on the left who say, look at the majority, you should have been more radical. You've missed this big opportunity. For Keir Starmer's team, this is an absolute vindication of the argument they made all the way through, is that you win from the middle, you show responsibility with money. Rachel Reeves is going to keep a tight grip on the chequebook, because that's how they did win, whether it was with a surge of enthusiasm. I don't think in 2024 any politician who's even vaguely in the middle is expecting a surge of enthusiasm from anywhere.
I think they need a series of quick wins. I think I've had enough of this import from the US 100 days, like I've had enough of the import supermajority. Here's a time frame I want to test out with you two that's untested on Radio 4 so far. It's 30 days.
Because your money back.
Because please don't let's ever give that promise.
Another snap election.
Well, actually, you've summed it up very well, because in 30 days, in August, so big is the work to do, they're all going to go on holiday. So it's so big, we've got to change the country, we must go on holiday.
Well, they're going to shorten the holiday, I think.
Well, I'm going to say that they've got 30 days, they've got July to bring about some quick wins. And I sniff a few. I've seen some goats. I've seen Nick Eardley on the news.
Let's clarify what you mean by goats.
Government of all the talent, borrowed from Gordon Brown.
So not actually goats.
Not.
So you're talking about Sir Patrick Vallance, who's actually going to be Lord Sir High Uber Commander Professor Sir
Professor.
Actually, I want my money back.
Sir Patrick Vallance, who of course became known to the public as the chief scientist during the COVID inquiry. Not during the COVID inquiry, during the pandemic.
He was in that too.
And he was in that too. All these big acts that we've had over the last few years. So he is becoming a government minister, and he is going to go and work in the DSIT, which is a terrible Whitehall acronym, but the Department for Science. That's a star hire, I think it would be fair to say. James Timpson, also, who's a really interesting man and employer, and somebody who has made a lot of, I suppose, changed a lot of lives by employing lots of people when they leave prison. He's becoming a minister as well, and also somebody with conservative tendencies previously. So that's interesting.
Well, his brother was a Tory minister.
His brother was a Tory minister, indeed. Also, another one that's not out there yet, but I'm told that Alan Milburn, former health secretary, is going to become an enforcer at the Department for Health, which is an interesting one. So tackling waiting lists. So they are looking with these little nuggets, as you say, to show soon, as quickly as they can, that they can get things done. Wes Streeting's already been on the phone to the BMA to try to sort out the junior doctor strike. I mean, that would be a big win. I think it's also ambitious to imagine are suddenly is this very strongly motivated organisation of young and some quite radical doctors, are they going to suddenly say, yes, we will do a deal with you? Who knows? That is a big one.
Can I make 3 observations there? So often with these goats who are brought in from outside, especially in the Brown era, it sort of didn't really work out. These people who were high flyers in their fields, whether it was defence or health, didn't really gel with the civil service and the political machine, and they found it quite hard. Patrick Vallance is different because he's been right in the bunker in the crisis,
and look at the vaccine programme, right?
Exactly. He knows how to pull levers and push buttons and chair meetings, so he is a sort of more natural fit for that. Although I'm quite surprised, because I thought maybe he was going to be brought in as more of a czar, because Labour's got this whole mission approach to government. We have 5 big missions.
So you're now
Stars and goats.
Goat or czar?
Goat or czar.
It sounds like a Eurovision.
This sounds like a Catherine the Great TV miniseries.
Can you? Was there a third observation?
No, that was actually my first observation.
Oh,
There was 2 mini observations. It was like a Kinder egg. Anyway, so the second observation is about James Timpson. I was just watching an interview that Christian Guru Murthy did with him on Channel 4 News a few months ago. And James Timpson is of the view that a third of the people who are in prison should not be there, and a further third of them should actually be maybe having more support and rehabilitation and help rather than being in prison 24/7.
Can I interrupt you a second?
Please do.
So
because then it gives me time to remember my third point.
But the Daddy Timpson is a long-time guest on Broadcasting House, John. And they've long employed prisoners. And here's the thing about prisons, which are so full, we're going to release people early. That's what's happening right now. That many of the people in there, maybe 40%, are re-offenders. So one way to cut the prison population is to stop re-offending. One way to stop re-offending is to give prisoners a job. Hold your nose and give prisoners a job. And the Timpson family have been doing that.
Yep.
They've also been giving clean suits to people who are unemployed. And it's a sort of old-fashioned conservative philanthropy imported by the new Labour man who is flexing the Prime Minister's office. And I've always thought that was something Rishi Sunak was learning to do at the end by importing David Cameron. Keir Starmer has been preparing, as we're going to hear from Laura, for months for this moment. And I know you've got some really juicy detail, but I've interrupted your third observation.
It was about Alan Milburn. So on Thursday night, election night, for Newscast, we hosted this big watch party in the Radio Theatre where lots of Newscast fans came and watched the results. And we also had lots of guests coming off your programme, Laura, and the radio programme that Nick and Rachel Burden were doing to come and have a sort of fireside chat in a slightly more chilled environment with us. And it was interesting. Most of the Labour people referenced Alan Milburn as a person from the old days who got things done, knew how to run a government. And you were saying when we were chatting beforehand that actually he's been sort of advising them and now he's actually going to come back. But I do just wonder, he was a polarising figure in the Blair
on the
era.
left, for sure.
Exactly, because he was like, private sector, public sector, I don't care who delivers your eye test, bring it on. And he said hard truths to the medical profession. So I'm just thinking, if Wes Streeting's first call is to the BMA, and they're all becoming quite like firebranding radically the leadership of the BMA, but then his second call is to Alan Milburn, that's another contradiction there to add to the list of contradictions.
But I think that what Labour people would push back at you and say it's not a contradiction. I think they would say that is reality.
Oh, yeah.
Actually,
Oh, totally.
serious politics is about getting things done where you have to have people on different sides. And the point is that maybe everybody has to lose a little bit of the thing that they hold dear as a conviction, but that's not real life. And I think Keir Starmer has always been asked again and again and again since the first time he ran for the leadership. And I remember doing this myself and sort of being a bit stumped when what he said was what he stood for was moral socialism. And
You are?
right. I mean, it sounded like a something that had been created for a Guardian headline. And it was indeed, I think, a Guardian headline. Now, he, years later, still hasn't, for some people in the Labour Party, even one experienced former advisor was saying to me last night, I still don't really know what he believes in. But I think, actually, with Keir Starmer, to look for an ideology is to miss the point. He wants to do things. This is what people say flatteringly about him. They say he's a doer, not a thinker. But that still leaves for some kind of political superfans. But where's his ideology? Give me something to believe in. His counter would be, well, I've got a huge majority and I want to get things done and I want to change the country. And that is much more important than making somebody feel good because they read a pamphlet that tickled their belly.
Can we just do a new chapter heading?
Yeah.
So news that we've going to be told now that we haven't heard before. Some of it a scoop from Laura Kuenssberg. So what is Labour doing now? They've been working with very recently Tory cabinet ministers to pave the way for transition.
Yeah, it's one of the things that's been part of their preparation. There have been at least a couple of Tory ministers involved, which is interesting, or formerly Tory ministers. They have also had an incredibly extensive period of preparation with each other under the leadership of Sue Gray, who becomes Keir Starmer's chief of staff, but also with Whitehall. And I'm told that Sue Gray really has been speaking to senior mandarins, as they're sometimes called, in Whitehall on an almost daily basis since January.
Since January. But obviously this has accelerated over time. In the last few weeks, shadow ministers have been introduced and have been speaking to their permanent secretaries. Those are the most senior civil servants in each department. And essentially what has happened is this work has built up and up and up and up and up and up. So in Whitehall, officials have been sitting not just with the Labour manifesto, but with their mission plans and their documents. And they've been sitting and discussing and workshopping, I was told, some of how they might make these things happen. And there is no doubt that the polling situation has meant that these preparations are more extensive than they might have been in another set of circumstances. And it's so interesting that this is sort of almost a thing itself. The transition, the preparation, it has been also a huge job of work going on quite separately. In fact, even in an office around the corner, not in Labour HQ, in a different office, an overspill office, that's where Sue Gray and her team have been doing preparation. And in most of the shadow teams, certainly the bigger ones, the bigger departments, there's been one or two of the team who've been doing the prep and other people have been doing the campaign. So it has been meticulously planned. But the interesting thing about all of it is they are first, I think we've just seen actually the first picture of the new cabinet sitting around the table has just emerged as we're talking to you at 11:20 on Saturday morning. The interesting thing is that somebody, a very senior person in Whitehall said to me, the thing is, I think they are ready. I think they're probably as ready as you can be. But actually, nothing can completely prepare you. And there were two particular moments they referenced. There's one moment where they come in, they're exhausted, they're elated. And then you say, OK, Prime Minister, but now we need to talk to you about the end of the world. Yeah, here's the
and nuclear codes and all of those things. But there's one other thing that it's just interesting to see that and someone who had seen lots of prime ministers come and go said to me that what they also worry about is that moment when they're literally about to go in and see the monarch. The kind of, what do I do? And actually, whether it was Liz Truss, Theresa May, David Cameron, or other people who, as leader of the opposition, or ministers, or someone like Keir Starmer, plainly they will have met the monarch, as you do on previous occasions. But that moment where they ring the bell or whatever they do, and they're standing outside the room about to be taken in for that moment, where they are invited to become the Prime Minister, apparently the routine is they tend to ask really detailed, well, what do I do and where do I stand and exactly what do I do? Because all the preparation in the world, that's not going to make you ready for that.
Although I was going to say, one of the innovations in our constitution is actually there is video of Starmer meeting King Charles yesterday for their audience, which we never used to have.
But
and then the camera's turned off and you don't see the kissing of the hand moment, obviously.
Actually, Keir Starmer is King Charles III's third Prime Minister, which is a tip a hat tip to the churn, the Conservative churn. And the system used to work that you did in opposition prepare for your brief. And younger listeners will be used to Conservative people handing over to Conservative people in a crisis without time to do this transfer. So, and you'd get a new minister, in the case of housing, 16 of them in 14 years. And it wasn't as if they had 1 second's preparation. So actually, a lot of civil servants, journalists and voters will think it's actually quite a good idea for the opposition to learn how to get in charge of their brief, talk to the civil service, in case the public are vicious enough to ask for a change of power instead of just letting Conservatives pass the hat round.
Well, let's talk about the Tories, but before we do, I just have to tell you one of the more unusual forms of preparation that has gone on in the Treasury. Did you know, Adam, that in the Treasury there has for many years been, shall we say, a gentleman's bathroom for the Chancellor, a private bathroom that includes something that a female chancellors or females in general wouldn't actually want to use, a urinal.
Right.
And during the preparations for government, expecting that Rachel Reeves was very likely to be the first female chancellor, there was a debate in the Treasury over what to do about said urinal. I'm told, however, it's been boxed in, so not to offend Rachel Reeves as she arrives and gets down to work.
Well, so there's just like a big, like random wooden box there instead of.
Well, the thing is,
They haven't removed it.
To be fair, it's a
because
metaphor.
goodness knows there'll probably be another man along any minute now,
exactly.
so you wouldn't want to do that.
It's a metaphor, isn't it? Because chancellors are
Isn't
often
it?
boxed in.
Oh,
but the thing
Paddy,
is,
you're
Also,
right.
we're also talking
No,
about
but it's-
ceramic things in the Treasury. There's also a Newscast mug in her kitchen around the corner from her office that was smuggled in a few years
But it
ago.
would be a sign to just take it out. How about that?
Well, exactly. Take it out.
So the fact that they've left it in, if I was Rachel Reeves, I'd insist they take it out.
Yeah, but
Be a
major
good photo
plumbing
op.
increased the risk of leaks. Bam!
Well,
On a serious point about I was really struck by Rachel Reeves' statement that she gave to Treasury officials yesterday. Two things. One, saying we need to talk about, and it's usually women in underappreciated areas of the economy, they need to be brought into policy making. And also the Treasury, she said this building's got to be about growth, because actually up until now the Treasury, of course they care about economic growth, but delivering growth has been in other departments.
Okay, we don't have growth of this programme. We hardly have any time left. It's 11:25.
Let's do 6
You're
hours.
listening to
That's what I've got to
Newscast. Shush! We have to talk about what happened to the Tories. Their terrible defeat. This is what Rishi Sunak said yesterday morning.
To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters.
There are no Conservative MPs in Oxfordshire since the birth of electricity now. It hasn't happened since the Great Reform Act. The change in the country has been massive. And one of the biggest changes is I've very rarely heard someone say, I am sorry in that way from Downing Street.
Wasn't it interesting? So some people think actually that was the best communication and the most human that they've ever seen, the Prime Minister. You know,
Because the others didn't have their claws on him, because he was completely owned during the campaign by people probably from Australia. That's where they get them from, isn't it? Tell them what to do.
Well, one of them was there.
Well, I mean, the thing is, he's learnt a lesson. It's completely opposite of Boris Johnson telling everyone, you know, the herd moves.
Hasta la vista.
And
gosh, we almost got to the end of this programme without you doing an impression. I was going to leave terribly sad.
well, it's a
but
graceful speech.
it was a very graceful speech, as was Jeremy Hunt's, and actually, as was Keir Starmer, was also very gracious about Rishi Sunak. So perhaps we are opening a more gracious period of politics. Perhaps. Let's see
I've
how
thought
long
that
that
before.
lasts. However, so there is now a question. We don't know how long the Tory leadership race is going to be. They haven't got a new all-powerful 1922 committee, which is a committee of MPs that sets out the rules. There is, however, a very long list of people who fancy a tilt at it. So it will probably be a bit like the Grand National. We might just possibly hear from some of them on my programme tomorrow morning.
Oh, really?
Just possibly. I'll just put that out there.
And your door is
I
open
shouldn't
to
say
others.
that now, actually, because, of course, they'll probably phone up and go, nah, change my mind.
I hope you do better than I did, because I had, two of them in my microphone zone. Being
On Thursday night.
Dame Priti Patel and James Cleverly at the same district council, Braintree, with 2 parliamentary constituencies, and they did not want to address succession.
No. And I think the timing will be interesting. Somebody involved in all of this said to me this morning, if Rishi Sunak says he's only going to stay for a couple of weeks, there'll be a certain kind of frantic race. there is quite a push from senior people to actually see if they can get him to stay up, perhaps up until party conference, so they can take a breath and sort of have a proper think rather than descend into sort of bloodletting straight away. And we should, as we close, though, just say this was also a fantastic night for the smaller parties. So we're looking at the biggest share in history for the parties that weren't the red team or the blue team, whether that's the Lib Dems' success, although the SNP did obviously have a disaster, but the Greens did well. Plaid Cymru obviously are in there as well. You know, this was a really interesting election for all sorts of reasons. Huge Labour victory, but underneath that, there was a really strong pattern of a sort of political rainbow in terms of where voters went.
And the Greens targeted 4 seats and were very explicit about that. And they won 4 seats. So it looks like maybe that party has learned how to make the electoral system work to its advantage.
And the electoral system, for the first time, actually has sent Nigel Farage to Parliament. He'll be there with his other small group of Reform MPs. But obviously we know, even when he hasn't had a political perch, he's still somebody who tries to have a big voice. But it will be fascinating to see how and if he does really use it in Parliament. We just don't know how that's going to play out. We will join each other again tomorrow morning, won't we? You'll be on the radio, I'll be on the television, and then we'll be on the weekend Sunday newscast later in the day. But I think that's plenty from us for now.
But if you'd like to get in touch, our email address is newscast@bbc.co.uk, and we'll be back for one more live helping next weekend. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.